Before we dive in, pause for a moment and tell me something. Where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Maybe it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in France. Don't just watch quietly. Drop a comment below, and let's see how far this story reaches across the world. Now, lean in, and let's begin. Sheriff Étienne Marchand hit the dusty ground hard, blood spreading across his chest like spilled wine as three outlaws stood over him with smoking guns. The ambush had been perfect. They'd caught him checking the old Mercier place at sunset, when shadows made targets of honest men and killers invisible. His vision blurred as he watched the bandits rifle through his pockets, searching for the key to the jail where their leader waited for the morning gallows. This was how his story would end, he thought. Alone, betrayed, and forgotten in the dirt like so many lawmen before him. The saloon girl appeared like an angel of vengeance, her red dress bright as blood against the dying light. Camille Beaumont moved with deadly grace, a derringer in each hand, as she stepped from behind the abandoned barn where she'd been hiding. The outlaws spun toward her with confident sneers, seeing only a painted woman who'd wandered into the wrong fight. But Camille's first shot dropped the nearest bandit before he could clear leather, and her second sent another sprawling into the dust with a hole between his eyes. The third outlaw managed to draw his weapon, but Camille was already moving, rolling behind a water trough as bullets splintered wood around her. Étienne watched in amazement as this woman he'd dismissed as just another saloon whore fought with the skill of a seasoned gunfighter. She popped up from cover to fire again, her shot taking the last bandit in the shoulder and spinning him around like a child's top. He dropped his gun and ran, clutching his wounded arm and screaming for mercy that wouldn't come. "Sheriff," Camille called softly, kneeling beside him as his life leaked out onto the thirsty ground. Her hands were gentle as she pressed cloth against his wounds, but her eyes held depths he'd never noticed during her performances at the Silver Dollar. "Stay with me now. You're not dying on my watch." Her voice carried an authority that seemed impossible from someone the town treated like decorative furniture, and Étienne found himself obeying despite the darkness creeping in around the edges of his vision. As she worked to save his life with skills that suggested a past far more complex than anyone suspected, Étienne stared into eyes that held secrets deeper than any mine shaft. This saloon girl had just killed 2 men to save a sheriff who'd never shown her anything but cold politeness, and now she was fighting death itself to keep him breathing. Why would she risk everything for a man who'd never seen her as more than part of the town's moral decay? The question burned in his mind as consciousness slipped away, leaving him helpless in the hands of a woman whose true nature remained as mysterious as her motives. 6 months earlier, Étienne had stood at his wife's graveside and sworn an oath that would define the rest of his life. Marie had died giving birth to their stillborn son, and the double loss had carved something essential out of his heart, leaving behind a hollow man who wore a badge like armor against further pain. He'd promised her memory that he would never again open himself to the kind of love that could destroy a man so completely, never again risk the agony that came with caring too deeply for another human being. The town of Redemption Creek had welcomed him precisely because he was broken. A sheriff who asked no questions about the past, who enforced the law without the complications of personal relationships, who treated everyone with the same cold professionalism that kept him safely isolated from human connection. His reputation for fairness was matched only by his reputation for emotional distance, and both served the community's needs perfectly. They wanted justice without intimacy, protection without involvement, and Étienne delivered exactly that. His days followed a pattern that never varied. Morning rounds that took him past every business and home in town, afternoon paperwork that kept his hands busy while his mind stayed carefully blank, evening patrols that ended with him alone in his office, staring at wanted posters and trying not to think about the empty house that waited for him. The routine was numbing, exactly as he'd intended, creating a life that functioned without feeling. purpose without passion. The Silver Dollar Saloon existed at the edge of his professional world, a place he visited only when duty demanded it. He'd watched Camille perform dozens of times without really seeing her. His attention focused on keeping the peace, rather than appreciating the woman who commanded the stage with voice like honey and movements that stirred things in men they'd thought they'd forgotten. To him, she was just another element of the town's business landscape, no more personally significant than the banker or the blacksmith. But even in his carefully constructed emotional isolation, Étienne had noticed details about her that didn't quite fit the role she seemed to play. The way she handled drunks with just enough force to discourage them without causing real harm. The intelligence that flickered in her eyes when she thought no one was watching. The subtle way she seemed to gather information about everyone in town without appearing to pay attention to anything but her performance. He'd filed these observations away without examining them, not wanting to risk the curiosity that might lead to the kind of personal interest he'd sworn to avoid forever. Camille Beaumont was not what she appeared to be, and every performance on the Silver Dollar's small stage was as carefully calculated as any military operation. Born Camille Dubois in New Orleans, she'd been trained by the best. Her father had been a federal marshal who'd taught her to shoot before she learned to read, and her mother had been a Creole beauty who'd understood that a woman's greatest weapon was often the way men underestimated her intelligence. But that life had ended in blood and betrayal when corrupt officials had murdered her family for getting too close to a smuggling operation that reached into the highest levels of government. The transformation from marshal's daughter to saloon girl had been deliberate and complete, designed to create the perfect cover for her real mission in Redemption Creek. She'd been tracking the Garrett gang for 3 years, following a trail of robberies and murders that had led her to this dusty frontier town where the outlaws planned their next big score. Her performances were reconnaissance missions disguised as entertainment, allowing her to observe, listen, and gather intelligence while everyone assumed she was just another fallen woman selling smiles and songs for survival. Her singing voice, trained in New Orleans conservatories before the world went wrong, had become her most effective tool for gathering information. Men told secrets to saloon girls they'd never share with lawmen, and Camille had learned to encourage confidences while appearing to offer nothing more dangerous than temporary companionship. Every drink she served was an opportunity to overhear conversations. Every dance was a chance to position herself near important discussions. Every smile was calculated to lower guards and loosen tongues. The derringers she'd used to save Étienne were gifts from her father, perfectly balanced weapons that had been crafted by a master gunsmith in New Orleans. She'd practiced with them until shooting became as natural as breathing, until she could draw and fire with speed that would shame most professional gunfighters. But she'd also learned that her greatest protection came from being invisible. Men didn't worry about saloon girls overhearing their plans because they assumed such women lacked the intelligence or motivation to use dangerous information. Living the lie had cost her more than she'd expected when she first took on the role. 3 years of pretending to be something she despised. 3 years of enduring treatment that would have destroyed a weaker woman. 3 years of watching evil men prosper while she gathered evidence that might never be enough to bring them to justice. But tonight, watching Étienne bleed in the dirt, she'd abandoned her careful cover to save a man who represented everything she'd been fighting to protect: honor, justice, and the hope that good people could still triumph over corruption and violence. Dr. Philippe Renaud worked through the night with the focused intensity of a man who'd seen too much death to give up easily on life. His small clinic became a battlefield where he fought against bullet wounds, blood loss, and the kind of injuries that killed strong men despite the best medical care available on the frontier. Camille assisted with steady hands and surprising knowledge of field medicine, her movements suggesting experience with violence that went far beyond what any saloon girl should possess. "He's lost a lot of blood," the doctor muttered as he probed for the bullet lodged near Étienne's heart. Another few minutes and it would have been too late. His instruments gleamed in the lamplight as he worked, each movement precise and economical. Camille held pressure on the wound while monitoring the sheriff's breathing, her painted face a mask of concentration that revealed nothing of the emotions churning beneath her carefully maintained surface. The surgery stretched into the early hours of morning, with Camille never leaving Étienne's side despite the doctor's suggestion that she return to the saloon. Her presence raised questions that she couldn't answer without destroying the identity she'd spent 3 years building, but she found herself unable to abandon the man who'd become more important to her than her mission. Somewhere during the long months of watching him patrol the town with quiet dignity, she'd developed feelings that complicated everything she thought she knew about herself. When Dr. Renaud finally announced that the sheriff would live, Camille felt tears she hadn't shed since her family's murder streaming down her cheeks. The relief was overwhelming, followed immediately by the realization that she'd revealed too much about her true nature. A saloon girl might risk her life to help an injured lawman, but she wouldn't have the medical knowledge, shooting skills, or emotional investment that Camille had displayed. Her cover was compromised, and with it, her ability to complete the mission that had consumed her life for 3 years. As dawn broke over Redemption Creek, painting the sky the color of blood and gold, Camille sat beside Étienne's unconscious form and faced the choice that would define both their futures. She could disappear before he woke up, abandon her mission to protect her secret, and leave him to wonder what had really happened in that ambush. Or she could stay, answer the questions she saw forming in Dr. Renaud's curious eyes, and trust that the man she'd saved was worthy of the truth that could destroy them both. The decision would have to be made soon. Already she could hear voices in the street as the town began to wake and discover that their sheriff had nearly died in the night. Étienne awoke to find Camille asleep in the chair beside his bed, her hand resting protectively on his arm, as if she could guard him even in sleep. The morning light streaming through Dr. Renaud's windows revealed details he'd never noticed before. The calluses on her trigger finger that spoke of countless hours of practice, the small scar on her throat that suggested violence in her past, the way she slept with one hand near her concealed weapon even in apparent safety. This was not the face of a simple saloon girl, and Étienne found himself studying her with the same attention he'd once given to wanted posters. The town was buzzing with news of the ambush and rescue, but the details varied wildly depending on who told the story. Some claimed Camille had fought off a dozen outlaws single-handed. Others insisted she'd scared them away with screaming rather than gunfire, and a few skeptical voices wondered if the whole thing might have been staged for reasons they couldn't understand. The only consistent element was amazement that a saloon girl had possessed the courage and skill to save the sheriff's life when no one else had been willing to help. Dr. Renaud pulled Étienne aside once Camille had stepped out to fetch fresh water, his expression troubled by more than medical concerns. "Sheriff, that woman saved your life, but she's not what she appears to be. The way she handled my instruments, the knowledge of anatomy she displayed, the shooting skills she demonstrated. These things don't come from working in saloons. I think you should be very careful about trusting her, no matter how grateful you feel right now." His warning carried the weight of professional observation and personal concern. When Camille returned, she found Étienne watching her with eyes that held questions she wasn't ready to answer. The careful distance he'd maintained for months had been replaced by intense curiosity and something that might have been suspicion. "Miss Beaumont," he said formally, his voice still weak from blood loss but carrying unmistakable authority, "I need to know exactly what happened last night. Not the version you'll tell everyone else, but the truth. Who were those men? Why were they waiting for me? And how did you happen to be in exactly the right place to save my life?" The moment of reckoning had arrived sooner than she'd expected, and Camille felt the weight of 3 years of deception pressing down on her like a physical force. She could lie, maintain her cover story, and hope his gratitude would overcome his suspicions. Or she could tell him the truth and trust that the man she'd risked everything to save would understand why she'd been living a lie in his town. Her next words would either begin a partnership that could bring justice to the frontier or destroy the only chance she'd ever have to complete her father's final mission. As she looked into his eyes and saw the intelligence and integrity that had made her fall in love with him despite her best intentions, Camille realized the choice had already been made. Camille closed the clinic door and turned to face Étienne with the bearing of a woman preparing for battle. "My real name is Camille Dubois," she said quietly, her voice losing the sultry accent she'd cultivated for 3 years. "My father was Federal Marshal Jean-Baptiste Dubois, murdered in New Orleans for investigating a corruption ring that reaches into the territorial government. I've been hunting his killers ever since, and that trail led me to Redemption Creek because the Garrett gang is part of the network that destroyed my family." The confession hit Étienne like a physical blow, recontextualizing everything he thought he knew about the woman who'd saved his life. The pieces fell into place with terrible clarity. Her intelligence, her skills, her presence in exactly the right place at the right time. She hadn't been a guardian angel. She'd been a hunter using his town as bait to catch killers. "How long have you been lying to me?" he asked, his voice cold with the betrayal he felt despite understanding her reasons. 3 years, Camille admitted without flinching. "Since the day I arrived in Redemption Creek and saw that Silas Garrett was planning something big here, I needed cover that would let me move freely, gather information, and prepare for the moment when I could take him down. The saloon girl persona was perfect. Invisible to law enforcement, trusted by criminals, positioned to see everything while being suspected of nothing. Her explanation was clinical, professional, but her eyes held pain that suggested the deception had cost her more than he might understand. Étienne struggled to process the implications of her revelation while his wounded body reminded him how close he'd come to death. "The ambush wasn't random," he said, understanding dawning like a cold sunrise. "They were after the jail keys because Garrett's in my lockup waiting for the territorial judge. You knew this was coming, didn't you? You let me walk into that trap knowing I might die, just so you could catch them in the act." The accusation carried weight that made Camille flinch as if he'd struck her. "I followed you to warn you," she said desperately, her composed facade cracking for the first time since he'd known her. "I'd learned about the ambush an hour before, but you'd already left for your evening rounds. I tried to catch up, tried to get there before they could position themselves, but I was too late to prevent the attack. All I could do was make sure they didn't succeed in killing you." Her voice broke on the last words, revealing emotions she'd been hiding behind her professional mask for longer than either of them realized. Silas Garrett sat in his cell like a spider at the center of a web, his cold eyes studying Étienne and Camille through the bars with amusement that chilled the blood. The outlaw leader was older than his reputation suggested, with silver hair and gentleman's manners that concealed a mind capable of orchestrating violence across 3 territories. When he spoke, his cultured voice carried echoes of Eastern education and Southern aristocracy that made his criminal empire seem even more obscene. "Well, well," Garrett said with genuine pleasure, "the famous Marshal Dubois' little girl, all grown up and playing dress-up in frontier saloons. Your father was a persistent man, my dear. Persistent and ultimately foolish. He thought he could take down an organization that has roots in Washington itself. I'm afraid his sense of justice exceeded his understanding of political reality. His words carried casual cruelty designed to inflict maximum emotional damage on his captive audience." Étienne watched Camille's face go white with rage and pain, her hand moving instinctively toward her concealed weapon before she caught herself. Garrett's admission confirmed everything she'd told him while revealing the scope of corruption they were facing. This wasn't just about local outlaws. It was about a criminal network that had infiltrated the federal government itself, making any hope of legal justice seem impossibly naive. Your father discovered that certain territorial officials were providing information about gold shipments, stagecoach schedules, and law enforcement movements to my organization, Garrett continued conversationally. When he refused our generous offer to share in the profits, he became a liability that had to be eliminated. The same fate awaits anyone else who threatens our arrangements, including stubborn sheriffs and their pretty little friends who think justice matters more than survival. The threat was explicit and immediate, but it was Garrett's next revelation that truly shook both listeners. Did you think last night's ambush was coincidence, Sheriff? My men have been watching this town for months, waiting for the right moment to complete an operation 3 years in the making. Your capture was just the beginning. Tomorrow's stagecoach carries more than passengers and mail. It carries the evidence that could destroy half the territorial government if it reaches the federal courts. My job is to ensure that evidence never arrives at its destination, and your little friend's interference won't change that outcome. His smile promised violence beyond anything they'd yet experienced, making both Camille and Étienne realize their personal conflict was about to become part of something much larger and more dangerous than either had imagined. The weight of Garrett's revelation transformed the dynamic between Étienne and Camille from suspicion to necessity, personal betrayal giving way to shared purpose in the face of overwhelming odds. Standing in the jail corridor with the outlaws' threats echoing around them, they realized that their individual missions had converged into a single fight for justice that would require everything they had to give. The luxury of hurt feelings and damaged trust was something they could no longer afford. "We need to talk," Étienne said quietly, leading Camille out of the jail and into his office where they could speak privately. His movements were still careful due to his wounds, but his voice carried new determination born of understanding exactly what they were facing. If Garrett's telling the truth about tomorrow's stagecoach, then we're dealing with corruption that goes beyond anything I'm equipped to handle alone. I need to know everything you know about his organization. Camille spread a map on his desk and began marking locations with the precision of a military strategist planning a campaign. The Garrett gang has been operating for 5 years, always one step ahead of territorial law enforcement because they have inside information about every major investigation. My father identified at least 6 officials who were feeding them intelligence, but he was killed before he could prove it in court. The evidence on tomorrow's stagecoach is his work, documents he hid before his death that name names and provide proof of the conspiracy. As she outlined the scope of the criminal network, Étienne began to understand why a federal marshal's daughter would spend 3 years living a lie in a frontier saloon. This wasn't just about revenge for her father's murder. It was about preventing a level of corruption that could destroy faith in territorial government itself. The stakes were enormous, the enemies powerful, and the resources available to fight them pathetically inadequate. "So what's the plan?" Étienne asked, studying the marked map with growing respect for the intelligence operation Camille had been conducting under his nose. "We can't protect the stagecoach with just the 2 of us, especially with me half dead from bullet wounds. But we can't let Garrett's people steal evidence that could expose the whole conspiracy." The problem seemed impossible, but he could see Camille's mind working through possibilities with the same methodical approach her father had probably used to build cases against criminals who thought themselves untouchable. "We don't protect the stagecoach," Camille said with a smile that was equal parts beautiful and terrifying. "We make sure the evidence reaches its destination by a route they'll never expect, while giving them a target they can't resist attacking. Sometimes the best way to catch predators is to make them think they're hunting prey." Her plan was forming as she spoke, and Étienne realized he was about to become part of an operation that would either vindicate her father's sacrifice or get them both killed in the attempt. The plan they developed over the next 12 hours was audacious, dangerous, and completely dependent on Garrett's men behaving exactly as Camille predicted they would. The real evidence would be smuggled out of town, hidden in Dr. Renault's medical supplies. following a route that would take it safely to the federal courthouse while avoiding the ambush points Garrett's gang had prepared. Meanwhile, the official stagecoach would carry decoy documents designed to lure the outlaws into a trap that would finally expose their network. Étienne's role required him to appear weak and unprepared, maintaining the illusion that he was still recovering from his wounds and unaware of the threat to the stagecoach. The performance was easier than he'd expected. His body was genuinely weak from blood loss, and the effort of normal movement left him genuinely exhausted. But beneath the facade of an injured lawman, he was positioning himself and his limited resources for a confrontation that would determine the future of justice in the territory. Camille's part was more complex, requiring her to maintain her saloon girl persona while secretly coordinating with allies Étienne hadn't known existed. Her 3 years in Redemption Creek had been spent building a network of informants and supporters, bartenders who overheard criminal plans, working girls who observed suspicious behavior, and honest citizens who'd grown tired of corruption but hadn't known how to fight it effectively. The operation she'd constructed was as sophisticated as anything a federal marshal could have assembled. The most dangerous element of their plan involved using Garrett himself as unwitting bait, allowing him to believe his escape was proceeding according to his organization's schedule while actually leading his rescue attempt into a carefully prepared ambush. Camille had spent months learning the gang's communication methods, their recognition signals, and their standard operating procedures. Now she would use that knowledge to turn their own efficiency against them. As the sun set on what might be their last night alive, Étienne and Camille stood together on the jail's roof, watching the horizon for signs of movement that would signal the beginning of their desperate gambit. The woman beside him was no longer the mysterious saloon girl who'd saved his life. She was Marshal Dubois' daughter, a trained federal agent who'd sacrificed 3 years of her life to complete her father's mission. And despite everything she'd hidden from him, despite the lies and deception and manipulation, Étienne found himself falling in love with the fierce intelligence and unwavering courage that had made such sacrifices possible. Tomorrow would bring violence, revelation, and consequences that neither could fully predict. But tonight, they had each other, and that would have to be enough. Dawn brought the carefully orchestrated chaos of their deception into motion, with the stagecoach departing Redemption Creek exactly on schedule, while carrying passengers who were actually disguised federal agents and cargo that would lead Garrett's men into the trap Camille had spent 3 years preparing. Étienne watched from his office window as the coach rolled past, knowing that everything now depended on timing, luck, and the hope that criminals would behave as predictably as Camille believed they would. The real evidence had left town hours earlier, hidden in Dr. Renault's medical bag as he departed for what appeared to be a routine house call to a ranch 20 miles south. The route would take him away from all known ambush points, while placing the crucial documents safely in federal hands before Garrett's organization could react. It was elegant, simple, and completely dependent on no one discovering the substitution until it was too late to matter. Garrett's escape attempt began exactly as Camille had predicted, with 3 of his men arriving at the jail disguised as federal marshals, transferring the prisoner to territorial court. Their forged documents were perfect copies of legitimate paperwork, and their knowledge of proper procedures would have fooled any sheriff who hadn't been warned in advance. But Étienne was ready for them, playing his role as the injured lawman who was too weak and confused to resist their authority. The fake marshals took custody of Garrett with professional efficiency, loading him into their wagon while maintaining the illusion that this was a routine prisoner transfer. Étienne watched them depart with apparent resignation, knowing that hidden observers were already following the wagon toward its rendezvous with the rest of the gang. Phase 1 of Camille's plan had succeeded perfectly. Now came the dangerous part where everything could go wrong in ways they hadn't anticipated. Camille appeared at his office door as the wagon disappeared from view, no longer bothering to maintain her saloon girl persona now that the operation was in motion. She moved with the fluid confidence of someone who'd trained for exactly this moment, checking her weapons and equipment with methodical precision. "They'll reach the ambush point in 2 hours," she said quietly. "The stagecoach should arrive 30 minutes later, giving us time to position ourselves before the shooting starts. After that, it's just a matter of staying alive long enough to see who survives." Her matter-of-fact tone couldn't hide the fact that they were both probably going to die in the next few hours, but she seemed almost relieved that the waiting was finally over. Red Rock Canyon was perfect for ambushes. High walls that channeled traffic through a narrow passage, plenty of cover for attackers, and escape routes that led deep into wilderness where pursuit would be almost impossible. Garrett's men had chosen the location well, positioning themselves with military precision while their leader watched from a concealed vantage point that commanded the entire battlefield. From where Étienne and Camille lay hidden on the canyon rim, they could see the outlaws preparing for what they believed would be a simple robbery of a vulnerable stagecoach. The gang was larger than Étienne had expected, at least a dozen men with modern weapons and the kind of coordination that suggested professional military experience. These weren't ordinary frontier outlaws driven to crime by desperation. They were soldiers in a criminal army that had been built to challenge territorial authority itself. The realization made their chances of survival seem even more remote than he'd originally calculated. Camille studied the scene below through field glasses that had belonged to her father, her expression grim as she counted weapons and assessed positions. "There," she whispered, pointing to a cluster of rocks where additional men waited in reserve. "And there, that's their escape route if things go wrong. They've planned this perfectly, assuming they're facing ordinary law enforcement. They have no idea we're up here watching them prepare to walk into a trap." Her voice carried satisfaction mixed with apprehension as she contemplated the violence about to unfold. The sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed off the canyon walls as the stagecoach neared the ambush point, its driver maintaining the steady pace of someone unaware of danger ahead. But Étienne could see the tension in the man's posture that suggested he was actually one of Camille's federal allies, ready to react when the shooting started. The passengers would be armed agents prepared for battle, not helpless civilians caught in criminal crossfire. As the coach entered the killing ground, Garrett raised his hand to signal the attack, and Étienne felt time slow to crystalline clarity. Everything now depended on split-second timing and the hope that justice could triumph over corruption through superior planning and desperate courage. He looked at Camille one last time, seeing in her face the determination that had sustained her through 3 years of dangerous deception, and realized that whatever happened in the next few minutes, he was proud to stand beside someone who'd sacrificed everything for the principles her father had died defending. The battle for Redemption Creek was about to begin. The first shots echoed off the canyon walls like thunder, shattering the morning quiet as Garrett's men opened fire on what they believed was a helpless stagecoach. But instead of screams from terrified passengers, they were answered by disciplined return fire from federal agents who'd been waiting for exactly this moment. The ambush became a pitched battle as outlaws who'd expected easy prey found themselves facing professional lawmen armed with superior weapons and tactical knowledge. Étienne and Camille added their firepower from above, their elevated position allowing them to rain bullets down on gang members who'd thought themselves safely concealed behind rocks and brush. Camille's rifle spoke with deadly precision, each shot carefully aimed to eliminate specific threats while conserving ammunition for the prolonged fight she knew was coming. Her father's training was evident in every movement as she worked the lever action with mechanical efficiency. The battle's tide turned when Garrett realized he'd been outmaneuvered, his voice roaring commands that tried to rally his men for a coordinated withdrawal. But the canyon that had been chosen for its tactical advantages now became a trap, with federal agents blocking the main escape route, while Étienne and Camille commanded the high ground. The outlaws found themselves caught in a killing ground of their own making, their superior numbers meaningless against better positioning and preparation. Desperation made the surviving gang members dangerous in new ways, with some attempting suicidal charges against fortified positions, while others tried to scale the canyon walls despite withering fire from above. Étienne watched men he'd known by reputation die in the dust below, their criminal careers ending in violence that served neither justice nor mercy. The cost of corruption was being paid in blood by everyone involved, innocent and guilty alike. When Garrett himself fell with a bullet through his chest, mortally wounded but still conscious enough to understand that his empire was crumbling around him, the remaining outlaws lost heart and attempted to surrender. But federal agents had orders to take no prisoners who might escape territorial justice through political influence, and the shooting continued until the canyon floor was littered with bodies. Justice had been served, but the price had been higher than anyone should have been asked to pay. As smoke drifted across the battlefield like morning fog, Étienne and Camille climbed down to survey the aftermath of 3 years of planning, hoping the evidence that had cost so many lives would finally bring the corruption to an end. Garrett lay propped against a boulder, blood foaming at his lips as his life ebbed away like water through a broken dam. His eyes held the clarity that sometimes came to dying men, and when he saw Camille approaching, his expression shifted from pain to something that might have been regret. "Marshal Dubois' daughter," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the moaning of wounded men scattered across the canyon floor. "I should have killed you 3 years ago when I had the chance." Camille knelt beside the man who'd ordered her father's murder, her face showing no mercy, but also no unnecessary cruelty. "Tell me about the others," she said quietly, her notebook ready to record whatever confession he might offer. "Give me the names of the officials who bought and sold justice like it was cattle at market." "You're dying, Garrett. Make it count for something by telling the truth for once in your miserable life." The outlaw leader's laughter turned into a coughing fit that sprayed blood across his shirt front, but his eyes remained focused on her face with intensity that suggested important revelations were coming. "You think this ends with me?" he gasped between bloody coughs. "This organization has roots you never imagined, little girl. Territorial Governor Williams, Federal Judge Morrison, half the cavalry officers in the territory, they're all part of the network your father tried to expose. Kill me, and someone else takes over, arrest them, and their replacements will be just as corrupt." Étienne joined them in time to hear Garrett's confession, his wounded body moving carefully as he knelt on the other side of the dying criminal. The scope of corruption Garrett described was staggering, reaching into every level of territorial government and making their victory here seem like a small triumph against overwhelming odds. If the outlaw was telling the truth, then bringing justice to the frontier would require more than capturing a few gang leaders. It would require rebuilding the entire system from the ground up. "But there's something you don't know," Garrett continued, his voice growing weaker as death approached. "Something that will make all your evidence worthless if you don't act fast. Tonight, a special train leaves for Washington carrying sealed orders that will replace every honest official in the territory with hand-picked corrupt ones. Your father's evidence might expose the current conspiracy, but it won't stop the new one that's already being put in place." His final revelation hit them like a physical blow, revealing that their victory was incomplete and their mission far from over. As Garrett's eyes closed for the last time, Camille and Étienne stared at each other across his body, understanding that the battle they'd just won was only the beginning of a war that could consume their lives and everyone they cared about. The evidence they'd fought so hard to protect would be meaningless if corrupt officials were replaced before it could be presented in court, and stopping a train bound for Washington would require resources and authority they didn't possess. Their love had been forged in the fires of shared danger, but now it would be tested by challenges that went beyond personal courage to questions of how far they were willing to go in pursuit of justice for a territory that might not deserve the sacrifices they were prepared to make. The special train was scheduled to depart from Sunrise Junction at midnight, carrying sealed orders that would destroy any hope of rooting out territorial corruption before new conspirators could take control. Étienne and Camille had 8 hours to cover 40 miles of rough terrain, stop a federally authorized train, and somehow prevent documents they couldn't legally intercept from reaching their destination. The task seemed impossible, but the alternative was watching justice die while evil prospered under official protection. They rode hard through country that tested both their horsemanship and their wounded bodies, pushing their mounts to speeds that risked killing the animals beneath them. Étienne's bullet wounds reopened during the desperate ride, staining his shirt with fresh blood, while Camille fought exhaustion that came from 3 years of constant vigilance and the emotional toll of finally avenging her father's murder. Neither complained about their pain, understanding that personal discomfort was irrelevant compared to the stakes they were racing to influence. The plan they developed during brief rest stops was born of desperation rather than tactical wisdom. They would present themselves as federal agents with emergency authority to inspect the train's cargo, hoping their official credentials would be accepted without too many questions. It was a thin deception that would collapse under serious scrutiny, but they were gambling that surprise and official-looking documents would carry them through the initial confrontation. Everything depended on maintaining their bluff long enough to locate and destroy the sealed orders. As they approached Sunrise Junction, they could see smoke from the special train's locomotive painting the evening sky with dark promises of departure. The station bustled with activity as railroad officials prepared for what they obviously considered an important journey, while armed guards positioned themselves around the platform with military precision. Getting close to the train would require more than luck. It would require the kind of desperate courage that had sustained them through everything else they'd faced together. Camille checked her weapons one final time, while Étienne struggled into a clean shirt that would make him look more like a federal agent and less like a man who'd been shot and ridden hard through hostile country. Their eyes met in the gathering dusk, and both understood that this might be their last moment together before the violence that would determine the future of an entire territory. "Whatever happens," Camille said quietly, "I want you to know that saving your life led me to find my own. I love you, Étienne Marchand, and I'm proud to stand beside you at the end of the world." Her confession was both declaration and farewell, preparing them both for the possibility that their love story might end in the next hour. The railroad platform at Sunrise Junction buzzed with nervous energy as officials supervised the loading of cargo that was obviously more important than ordinary freight. Étienne and Camille approached with the confident bearing of federal agents, accustomed to having their authority respected, their forged credentials ready to withstand casual inspection, while hoping no one would look too closely at details that couldn't survive expert scrutiny. The success of their mission now depended on bluffing their way past guards who had orders to kill anyone threatening the train's precious cargo. "Federal Marshal Marchand and Agent Dubois," Étienne announced to the station master, presenting documents that looked authentic enough to pass initial examination. "We're here to inspect cargo reported to contain contraband materials that could pose a threat to federal interests. I trust you'll provide full cooperation with our investigation." His Louisiana French accent, normally a liability in dealing with territorial officials, now suggested the kind of sophisticated background that federal agents might possess. The station master studied their credentials with the nervous attention of a man caught between conflicting authorities, clearly uncertain whether these unexpected agents had legitimate jurisdiction over a train carrying sealed federal orders. His hesitation gave them time to observe the platform's security arrangements and identify the specific car that held the documents they needed to intercept. but it also allowed the guards to study them with professional attention that could expose their deception if any of the men had experience dealing with real federal agents. "I'll need to telegraph territorial headquarters for confirmation," the station master said finally, his bureaucratic instincts warring with desire to avoid responsibility for delaying federal business. "These orders came directly from Washington, and I don't have authority to allow inspection without proper authorization." His words carried the weight of someone who'd learned to survive in territorial politics by never making decisions he couldn't defend to hostile superiors. The telegraph that would expose their deception began clicking out its message to officials who would immediately recognize the names Marchand and Dubois as wanted fugitives rather than federal agents. Camille's hand moved casually to her concealed weapon, while Étienne calculated distances to cover and obstacles to overcome in the violence that was now inevitable. Their bluff had failed, but they'd learned enough about the train's layout to have a fighting chance of completing their mission before dying in the attempt. The final confrontation was about to begin, and both lovers understood that success would require sacrificing everything they'd fought so hard to build together. The telegram's reply came back faster than expected, and the station master's face went white as he read words that transformed helpful federal agents into dangerous fugitives with prices on their heads. His hand reached for the alarm bell that would summon every guard on the platform. But Camille's derringer was already pressed against his ribs with pressure that promised instant death if he completed the motion. "Don't," she whispered with gentle finality, her voice carrying the same tone she'd used to sing lullabies to children who would never hear her true story. The platform erupted into violence as guards realized they were dealing with the wanted criminals they'd been warned about, rather than legitimate federal agents. Étienne's rifle spoke first, dropping 2 men before they could clear leather, while Camille used the station master as a human shield while fighting her way toward the train car that held their objective. Bullets shattered windows and splintered wooden platforms as a dozen armed men tried to kill 2 fugitives who'd already survived more than any reasonable person should have been able to endure. The battle became a running fight as Étienne and Camille used railroad cars for cover while working their way toward the sealed cargo that represented their only hope of preventing territorial corruption from becoming permanent. Each car they passed brought them closer to their goal, but also deeper into a trap that had no escape routes and no possibility of survival. They were fighting not to live, but to complete a mission that would outlast their deaths. Camille reached the target car first, her lockpicking skills learned from her father allowing her to breach the sealed door, while Étienne held off pursuers with disciplined rifle fire that made each shot count. Inside, she found crates of documents that represented the complete restructuring of territorial government along lines that would make justice impossible for generations to come. The orders were signed by officials whose names appeared on her father's list of suspected conspirators, proving that corruption reached all the way to Washington itself. As she worked to destroy the irreplaceable papers, gunfire intensified outside the car, and she heard Étienne cry out in pain as another bullet found its mark. Time was running out for both of them, but the documents were burning now, their ashes representing the death of a conspiracy that had cost her family everything they'd held dear. If they died in the next few minutes, at least they would die knowing that justice was still possible for people who were brave enough to fight for it regardless of the personal cost. Étienne stumbled into the car with blood streaming from a head wound that left him dizzy and half-blind, but his hands were steady as he helped Camille destroy the last of the sealed orders that would have cemented territorial corruption for decades to come. The flames consumed years of planning and millions of dollars in bribes, reducing the conspiracy to ashes that would blow away in the desert wind. Their mission was complete, but their lives were measured in minutes as guards surrounded the car with overwhelming firepower. "It's over," Camille said quietly, taking his hand as bullets splintered the wooden walls around them. "We did it, mon cher. Your father would be proud." Her words carried peace that transcended their desperate circumstances, the satisfaction of someone who'd finally completed a task that had consumed her entire adult life. She'd avenged her family's murder, exposed territorial corruption, and found love with a man worthy of her fierce heart, more than any reasonable person could have asked from such a short life. The guards' final assault came with the systematic precision of men who knew their targets were trapped and wounded, each position carefully chosen to prevent escape while maximizing their overwhelming numerical advantage. But Étienne and Camille had decided to make their last stand together rather than dying separately, their final battle becoming a declaration of love as much as an act of defiance. If death was inevitable, at least they would face it side by side. Their return fire was carefully rationed, each bullet aimed to inflict maximum damage while conserving ammunition for the prolonged fight they both knew they couldn't win. But something unexpected was happening outside the car. New voices were shouting orders, different guns were firing, and the systematic assault was degenerating into confused battle between multiple forces. Help had arrived from an impossible source, though neither could identify their saviors through the smoke and chaos of combat. As the shooting gradually died away and unfamiliar voices called for surrender from the railroad guards, Étienne and Camille held each other in the ruins of their temporary fortress, hardly daring to believe they might survive to see another sunrise. Someone was approaching the car with careful footsteps that suggested caution rather than hostility, and a voice called out in French that made both fugitives freeze with shocked recognition. "Marshal Dubois' daughter? This is Colonel Auguste Leclerc of the United States Army. Your father was my friend, and I've been hunting the same corruption that killed him. I think it's time we had a conversation about justice and the future of this territory." Colonel Auguste Leclerc appeared in the doorway like an answer to prayers neither Étienne nor Camille had dared to voice. His Union Army uniform bearing the insignia of someone with authority that superseded any territorial jurisdiction. Behind him stood a company of federal cavalry soldiers whose presence explained the sudden shift in battle fortunes. They'd arrived just in time to prevent the execution of two people whose evidence could finally bring justice to a corrupt territory. "Your father and I served together during the war," Leclerc explained, as his men secured the platform and tended to the wounded guards who'd survived the firefight. "When he wrote to me about territorial corruption, I began my own investigation through military channels. His murder convinced me that the problem was worse than anyone in Washington suspected, and your 3-year mission has provided the proof needed to clean house from top to bottom." His words carried the weight of federal authority backed by military force. The documents Camille had tried to destroy were valuable not just for the corruption they would have enabled, but for what their existence proved about the conspiracy's reach and organization. Colonel Leclerc's investigation had identified most of the key players, but he'd needed evidence of their coordination and planning to justify the massive federal intervention required to restore honest government to the territory. The sealed orders provided exactly that proof, making their attempted destruction unnecessary now that legitimate authority had arrived to protect them. "Governor Williams has already been arrested," Leclerc continued, "along with 6 territorial judges and a dozen cavalry officers who thought their positions made them untouchable. The evidence your father gathered, combined with what you've uncovered during your undercover mission, has given us everything needed to prosecute the entire network. Justice delayed is not justice denied when it finally arrives with sufficient force to ensure conviction." His satisfaction was evident as he described the downfall of men who'd thought themselves above any law. As they emerged from the bullet-riddled railroad car into moonlight that seemed impossibly bright after their brush with death, Étienne and Camille found themselves facing a future neither had dared to imagine possible. Their love had been forged in deception and violence, tested by betrayal and corruption, and ultimately vindicated by the arrival of justice they'd fought so hard to achieve. The lonely sheriff who'd sworn never to love again, and the saloon girl who'd lived a lie for 3 years, could finally begin building an honest life together. Their shared commitment to justice, providing a foundation stronger than any romantic fantasy could have offered. The federal courthouse in Denver became the stage for trials that would reshape territorial politics for a generation, with Étienne and Camille serving as star witnesses whose testimony exposed corruption that had seemed untouchable just weeks before. Their love story became secondary to the legal drama unfolding around them, but the strength of their partnership was evident as they faced hostile cross-examination designed to discredit their evidence through personal attacks on their relationship and methods. The defense attorneys hired by the conspiracy tried every possible strategy to undermine their credibility, attacking Camille's deception as evidence of inherent dishonesty, questioning Étienne's competence as a sheriff who'd been fooled for 3 years, and suggesting that their romantic involvement compromised their ability to testify objectively about criminal activity. But their evidence was too comprehensive, and their personal integrity too obvious to be destroyed by legal maneuvering. The convictions that followed sent shockwaves through territorial society, with sentences ranging from 20 years to life imprisonment for officials who'd thought their positions provided immunity from consequences. Governor Williams himself received the maximum penalty, his crimes including not just corruption but conspiracy to commit murder against federal officers. The message was clear. No one was above the law when federal authority was properly applied. But the trials also revealed the personal cost of their 3-year mission, with testimony exposing details of Camille's undercover work that made her sacrifices clear to everyone in the courtroom. She'd endured humiliation, danger, and isolation that would have broken most people, sustained only by determination to complete her father's work and the growing love for a man who'd proven worthy of her trust. Her courage became legendary among federal agents who understood what such assignments demanded. The territorial reorganization that followed the trials created opportunities for honest officials to rebuild government institutions along lines that served justice rather than private profit. Étienne was offered the position of territorial marshal, while Camille was invited to join the Federal Investigation Service as the territory's first female agent. Their partnership had evolved from personal love to professional collaboration that would define their lives for decades to come, proving that justice and romance could flourish together when both were based on shared principles rather than mere attraction. 6 months after the trials ended, Étienne and Camille stood together in the same church where he'd once mourned his first wife, but this time they were exchanging vows that would bind their lives together in partnership that transcended law enforcement careers or personal healing. The congregation included federal officials, reformed territorial leaders, and citizens whose lives had been touched by their fight for justice, a community built around shared commitment to honest government and equal treatment under law. Camille's wedding dress was simple white silk that couldn't hide the strength in her shoulders or the intelligence in her eyes, but it transformed the feared undercover agent into a radiant bride whose beauty took Étienne's breath away. She'd kept her father's derringer concealed beneath the flowing fabric. Old habits died hard for someone who'd lived with danger for so long. But her smile held peace that had been absent during their years of deception and violence. The ceremony itself was conducted in both English and French, honoring both their heritage and their shared future in a territory that was finally learning to balance justice with mercy. Dr. Renaud served as Étienne's best man, while Colonel Leclerc gave Camille away in memory of the father who couldn't be present to see his daughter's ultimate triumph over the forces that had destroyed their family. The vows they spoke were promises not just to love each other, but to continue serving the cause of justice that had brought them together. Their wedding reception became a celebration of more than personal happiness. It marked the successful transformation of a corrupt territory into something approaching the democratic ideals America claimed to represent. Former outlaws who'd accepted amnesty in exchange for testimony danced alongside federal agents who'd risked their careers to expose corruption, while honest citizens toasted a future that seemed brighter than anything they'd dared to hope for during the dark years of criminal government. As they walked through the crowd of well-wishers toward the carriage that would take them on their honeymoon, Étienne reflected on the journey that had transformed a lonely sheriff's heart from stone to flesh, capable of loving a woman whose courage exceeded his own. Camille had saved his life in that ambush, but more importantly, she'd saved his soul by proving that love could triumph over any obstacle when both partners were willing to fight for justice together. Their story had begun with deception and violence, but it was ending with truth and hope. Proof that even in the untamed West, love could indeed conquer all when it was built on foundations stronger than mere passion. The lonely sheriff had found his heart, the saloon girl had found her justice, and together they'd found a love that would inspire others to believe that good could triumph over evil when ordinary people found the courage to do extraordinary things for the sake of what they held most dear.